The cabin smelled like recycled air and cheap coffee. Rows of passengers slumped in their seats, scrolling phones or sleeping through the turbulence that rattled the fuselage every few minutes. Flight 447 from Dubai to London was unremarkable in every way except one. In seat 38C, a woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun stared out the window at the moonlit clouds below. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers occasionally twitching as if reaching for controls that weren't there. The flight attendant had tried twice to offer her wine. Both times she declined with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. In the cockpit, Captain Morris was mid-sentence about his daughter's upcoming wedding when his first officer went rigid. The radio crackled with a frequency they weren't supposed to monitor anymore, not since the protocols changed, not since the wars that weren't called wars ended. The voice that came through was clipped, urgent, using call signs from another era. Morris felt his blood go cold. He'd heard those codes before, in briefing rooms he wasn't supposed to remember. "Sir," the first officer whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "That's a Mayday, military encryption, old NATO frequency." Morris's hand hovered over the intercom. He knew the regulations. Civilian aircraft didn't get involved in military operations. They maintained course, reported what they heard, and let someone else handle it. But something in that transmission made his training scream at him to pay attention. The call sign came through again, clearer this time. Viper 9. He'd heard that name before. Years ago, in a bar in Germany where pilots who'd flown in places that officially never happened would drink and swap stories they'd never tell their families. The woman in 38C tilted her head slightly. Her eyes narrowed. She'd heard it too somehow through the cabin walls and the dull roar of the engines. A sound no civilian should recognize. Morris made a decision that would haunt him or save him, he wasn't sure which. He pressed the intercom button. His voice carried through the cabin, professional and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we may be experiencing some minor communication interference. Nothing to be concerned about." Then he did something he'd never done in 23 years of flying commercial. He left the cockpit and walked down the aisle until he reached row 38. He looked down at the woman with the silver-streaked hair. She looked up at him with eyes that had seen things he could only imagine. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think you need to hear something." She didn't ask what. She simply unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. The passengers nearby didn't notice. They were too absorbed in their screens and their sleep. But as she followed Morris back toward the cockpit, a businessman in 37D glanced up and froze. He stared at her profile, at the small scar above her left eyebrow, at the way she moved with purpose even in the cramped aisle. He'd seen that face before, in a photograph on a classified wall in Langley. Under the photo had been a name and a legend that everyone assumed was exaggerated. He watched her disappear behind the cockpit door and whispered to himself, "No way, that's impossible. She's supposed to be dead." The cockpit was cramped with 3 people inside. Morris gestured to the radio. The transmission was looping now, automated distress signal interspersed with human voices. The woman listened for exactly 7 seconds before her entire demeanor changed. Her spine straightened, her jaw set. Her hands, which had been still for the entire flight, suddenly moved with practiced precision. "That's Lieutenant Cade," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made both pilots instinctively defer to her. "He's flying a damaged Viper out of contested airspace. They've lost his support squadron." Morris stared at her. "How could you possibly know that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she leaned closer to the radio, adjusting frequencies with muscle memory that spoke of thousands of hours doing exactly this. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder. "Because I taught him that evasion pattern, and because he just used a call sign that only 5 people in the world would recognize." The first officer found his voice. "Who are you?" She glanced at him, and in that glance was a lifetime of missions that never made the news, of decisions made at 40,000 feet where a single mistake meant death, of nights spent in briefing rooms planning operations that would save lives no one would ever know were in danger. "My name is Commander Vesper Thorn," she said quietly, "and 12 years ago, they called me the Ghost of Kandahar." The cockpit went silent except for the hum of instruments and the desperate voice on the radio. Morris felt the weight of that name settle over him like winter frost. Everyone in military aviation knew the story, even if they only knew fragments. A pilot who'd flown missions so classified that her own government denied she existed. A woman who'd supposedly died in a crash over the mountains, her body never recovered. He looked at her standing there in civilian clothes, looking like any other passenger, and realized that everything he thought he knew was wrong. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. Vesper's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I was, for 11 years, 7 months, and 16 days, but right now, that kid up there doesn't have time for me to be dead." She pointed at the radio. "He's got maybe 8 minutes of fuel left, and he's being pursued by 2 aircraft that aren't supposed to exist in that airspace. If someone doesn't guide him to a safe vector, he's going to have to punch out over hostile territory." Morris made the second decision that would define the rest of his career. "What do you need?" Vesper looked at the instrument panel, calculating angles and distances and fuel burn rates with the kind of mental arithmetic that came from doing it under fire. "I need you to trust me, and I need you to not ask questions until this is over." The first officer started to protest, but Morris held up a hand. Something in Vesper's eyes told him that this wasn't a debate. This was survival. "Do it," he said. Vesper took the headset and switched to the military frequency. Her voice, when she spoke, was transformed. All traces of the quiet passenger vanished, replaced by the calm, commanding tone of someone who talked pilots through hell and brought them home. "Viper 9, this is Ghost Actual. I have your position, I have your bearing, and I have your 6. Do you copy?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Then through the static and the distance, a young voice responded, shaking, disbelieving. "Ghost Actual, confirm identification." Ghost Actual was KIA. "This has to be." Vesper cut him off, her voice sharp. "Viper 9, I don't have time for your existential crisis. You have 2 bogies on your tail, your fuel is critical, and your hydraulics are failing. I need you to focus. Acknowledge." The change was immediate. Training overrode shock. "Roger, Ghost Actual, I'm listening." And just like that, Commander Vesper Thorne was back in the war. The next 6 minutes were the longest of Captain Morris's life. He watched as Vesper transformed his cockpit into a tactical operations center, using their commercial radar to triangulate positions, her knowledge of the terrain to identify safe corridors, and her voice to keep a terrified young pilot from making the kind of mistake that would kill him. She spoke in vectors and altitudes, in phrases that sounded like a different language. "Viper 9, brake left, heading 270. Drop to Angels 15. You're going to thread between 2 radar stations and your window is 30 seconds wide." The young pilot's breathing was audible over the radio. "Ghost, I can't see the corridor. My instruments are partially down." Vesper closed her eyes. Morris watched her lips move silently, visualizing the geography from memory. When she opened her eyes again, they were absolutely certain. "You don't need instruments, Viper. Look for the mountain that splits like a fork. Your grandfather told you about it. The one that looks like a giant's hand reaching for the sky. You fly through the fingers." There was a pause. Then, "How do you know about my grandfather?" Vesper's voice softened for just a moment. "Because he taught me the same thing when I was 23 and scared out of my mind on my first real mission. He saved my life that day. Let me return the favor for his grandson." The radio crackled. "I see it. I see the mountain." Vesper's hands gripped the edge of the instrument panel. "Then fly, Viper, and don't look back." Morris watched the radar, 2 blips pursuing 1. The single blip descended, threading through what must have been an impossibly narrow gap. The pursuing aircraft broke off, unable or unwilling to follow through terrain that tight. For a moment, the single blip disappeared entirely below the radar threshold. Then it emerged on the other side, heading for friendly airspace. Viper 9's voice came through, steadier now. "Ghost Actual, I'm clear. I'm heading home." Vesper exhaled slowly. "Good work, Lieutenant Cade. Tell your grandfather Vesper says hello." The transmission ended. Vesper removed the headset and handed it back to the first officer. Her hands were shaking now, just slightly. The adrenaline that had sustained her was beginning to fade, leaving behind the reality of what had just happened. Morris stared at her. "You just violated about 15 international aviation laws." She nodded. Probably more than that. The first officer looked between them. We could lose our licenses, our careers, everything. Vesper met his eyes. That kid has a family waiting for him. He has a future. That's worth my ghost story becoming public. It's worth whatever happens next. Morris realized in that moment that he just witnessed something extraordinary. Not the tactical brilliance, though that was impressive enough, but the simple fact that this woman, who'd supposedly been dead for over a decade, had risked everything to save a stranger. He made his third decision of the night. As far as I'm concerned, we experienced some minor communication interference. Nothing unusual. You were never in this cockpit. Vesper looked at him with something like gratitude. Thank you, Captain. She turned to leave, to return to seat 38C and disappear back into whatever life she'd built in the years since everyone thought she'd died. But Morris couldn't let it end like that. Commander Thorne, he said. She paused at the door. How did you survive the crash? Everyone said there was no way. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years spent living with a secret too dangerous to share. I didn't want to survive. I wanted to disappear. There are some things you see, some things you do in war that make coming home harder than staying in the fight. So when they offered me a way out, I took it. Morris understood more than she probably realized. He'd flown in the Gulf. He knew about the missions that never made the official record. And now? Vesper smiled, and this time it was real. Now I teach high school physics. I have a cat named Newton. I go to the grocery store on Wednesdays. I live a life so ordinary that sometimes I almost forget who I used to be. She paused. Almost. She opened the cockpit door. Before she stepped through, she looked back one more time. But that kid up there gets to go home tonight, so maybe the ghost isn't quite ready to rest yet. Then she was gone, walking back down the aisle to her seat. Morris returned to his controls, his mind racing. The first officer was staring at him. What do we do? Morris thought about the young pilot who'd just been saved, about the woman in 38C who'd given up everything to escape a war, about the impossible choice between regulations and doing what was right. We fly this plane to London, he said finally, and we never speak of this again. But secrets have a way of refusing to stay buried. In seat 37D, the businessman was already typing on his phone. His fingers moved quickly across the encrypted messaging app. He worked for a private military contractor, and his job was to notice things other people missed. He'd noticed Commander Vesper Thorne. By the time Flight 447 landed at Heathrow, 3 different intelligence agencies would know she was alive. And by the time she cleared customs, decisions would be made in offices far above her pay grade about what to do with a ghost who'd suddenly become very real again. But Vesper didn't know any of that yet. She sat in 38C, watching the clouds drift past, thinking about a young pilot who'd get to see another sunrise, thinking about the grandfather who taught them both to fly, and thinking about the cost of being the person everyone thought was dead. The plane descended through the darkness toward London. In the cockpit, Morris made his approach with hands that were steadier than they should have been. In seat 38C, Vesper closed her eyes and remembered what it felt like to be alive. The landing was smooth, perfect, even. Passengers gathered their belongings, complained about the flight, and shuffled toward the exit. Vesper waited until the cabin was nearly empty before standing. She retrieved a small carry-on from the overhead bin, one that contained nothing remarkable. A change of clothes, a book she'd been reading, a life that fit in a bag. She walked through the terminal like any other traveler, anonymous in the crowd. But the businessman from 37D followed at a distance, speaking quietly into his phone. And in a windowless room beneath the airport, security footage was being reviewed by people who recognized her face. The ghost was home, and the world she'd left behind was about to come calling. Vesper cleared customs without incident. The officer barely glanced at her passport, which listed her as Margaret Vance, a teacher from Bristol. It was a good identity. She'd lived it for over a decade, and it had become more real than the woman she used to be. She took the Heathrow Express into the city, watching London slide past the windows. She'd always loved this city, its history, its resilience, the way it had survived wars and bombings and never stopped being itself. She understood that kind of survival. Her flat was in Islington, a third-floor walk-up in a converted Victorian that smelled like old wood and the curry from the restaurant downstairs. She climbed the stairs, key already in her hand. The door opened easily. Everything was as she'd left it, books stacked on the coffee table, Newton's food bowl empty by the kitchen, plants that probably needed watering. It was home, or the closest thing she had to one. She dropped her bag by the door and moved through the familiar space, touching things as if to confirm they were real. The teapot on the stove, the photos on the mantel, carefully curated to show a life she'd never actually lived, the diploma from a university she'd never attended, a life built on documentation and determination. She was filling Newton's bowl when she heard the knock. 3 precise raps, not the knock of a neighbor or a delivery person. This was the knock of someone who knew she was inside. Vesper's hand moved instinctively to her hip, reaching for a weapon that hadn't been there in 12 years. Old habits. She moved to the door and looked through the peephole. A woman stood in the hallway, mid-40s, dark suit, posture that screamed military even in civilian clothes. She was alone, but Vesper knew that meant nothing. Sent her there would be others, waiting, watching. Vesper opened the door but kept the chain on. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." The woman smiled. It wasn't warm. "Commander Thorne, or should I say Miss Vance, we need to talk." Vesper felt her carefully constructed world begin to crack. "I think you have the wrong person." The woman held up a phone. On the screen was footage from Flight 447. Vesper in the cockpit, clear as day. "We both know that's not true." Vesper stared at the footage for a long moment, calculating, assessing, coming to the conclusion she'd known was inevitable the moment she'd taken that headset. "Who sent you?" The woman pocketed the phone. "People who are very interested in the fact that the ghost of Kandahar just saved a pilot using civilian aviation resources. People who have questions about how you knew tactical information that's still classified. People who are wondering what else you've been doing for the last 12 years. Vesper felt tired suddenly, so tired. "I've been teaching physics, that's all. I'm not who I used to be." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I don't think that's true. I think you've been exactly who you always were. You just tried to pretend otherwise." She paused. "My name is Colonel Reeves. I'm with Joint Special Operations Command, and I'm here to offer you a choice." Vesper laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Let me guess. Come back to work or face consequences for tonight." Reeves shook her head. "Not consequences, questions, from people who will want to know how a dead woman saved a pilot, from people who will want to know what classified information you retained, from people who will make your quiet life very complicated." She paused. "Or, you come in from the cold, officially, and we make this all go away." Vesper understood the game. She'd played it before in different circumstances with different stakes. "And in return," Reeves's eyes were steady, "in return, you do what you do best. You train the next generation. You teach them what you know. You make sure they come home." It wasn't what Vesper expected. She'd assumed they'd want her back in the cockpit, flying missions that didn't exist. But training, that was different. That was a way to still be useful without losing herself entirely. "I need to think about it," she said. Reeves nodded. "You have 24 hours. After that, the questions start, and Margaret Vance's very ordinary life becomes very complicated." She turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Commander, what you did tonight saved that kid's life. Whatever happens next, that matters." Then she was gone, disappearing down the stairs. Vesper closed the door and leaned against it. Newton appeared from the bedroom, meowing his disapproval at the delayed dinner. She picked him up, holding him close, feeling his warmth and his simple, uncomplicated affection. "What do you think, Newton? Do ghosts get second chances?" She spent the night on her couch, not sleeping, just thinking, about the life she'd built, about the life she'd left behind, about the young pilot who'd called her ghost actual with such desperation in his voice, about Lieutenant Cade's grandfather who taught her to fly through mountains in darkness, about all the pilots who hadn't made it home, the ones she couldn't save. As dawn broke over London, painting her flat in shades of gray and gold, Vesper made her decision. She picked up her phone and dialed the number Reeves had left on a card. The colonel answered on the first ring. "Commander Thorne." Vesper watched the sunrise through her window. "I have conditions," she said. "I'm listening." Vesper thought about what she wanted, what she needed, what she could live with. I don't fly combat missions, I don't go operational, I train and nothing else, and I do it on my terms in my way. There was a pause, then agreed, anything else. Vesper smiled slightly. I keep teaching physics, 2 days a week. The kids need consistency. Reeves laughed. Done, welcome back, Ghost. The next morning, Vesper stood in front of her Year 11 physics class, teaching them about Newton's laws of motion. She used a paper airplane to demonstrate, sending it sailing across the classroom. The students laughed and took notes and had no idea that the woman explaining aerodynamics had once flown missions that changed the course of wars. At lunch, she received a text, an address in Hampshire, a time, instructions to come alone. That weekend, she drove out of London in her aging Honda, following country roads to a facility that didn't appear on any map. The guard at the gate checked her ID, made a phone call, and waved her through. She parked in front of a nondescript building that could have been anything, an office park, a warehouse, but Vesper knew military architecture when she saw it. Inside, Reeves was waiting. Welcome to Blackthorn. Vesper raised an eyebrow. Subtle, Reeves smiled. We thought you'd appreciate it. This is where we train pilots for operations that require a certain level of discretion. She led Vesper through corridors that smelled like coffee and jet fuel. You'll have full autonomy over curriculum, full security clearance, and access to simulation technology that didn't exist when you were flying. They stopped in front of a door marked Briefing Room 3. Inside, 6 pilots stood at attention. Young, eager, terrified they were about to be washed out. Vesper studied them, 3 men, 3 women, different backgrounds, different faces, but all with the same look in their eyes, the look that said they wanted to be the best, that they were willing to sacrifice everything to get there. At ease, Vesper said. They relaxed slightly, but their eyes never left her. Reeves stepped forward. This is Commander Vesper Thorne. Some of you may have heard of her. Most of what you've heard is wrong. But what matters is this. She's going to teach you things that will keep you alive when everything goes wrong. Listen to her, learn from her, and maybe you'll survive long enough to become half the pilot she was. Reeves left. The door closed. Vesper found herself alone with 6 pilots who were staring at her like she'd descended from mythology. She sighed. First rule, she said. Stop looking at me like I'm special. I'm not. I'm just someone who survived long enough to learn from my mistakes. One of the pilots, a young woman with sharp eyes and a confident stance, raised her hand. Permission to speak, ma'am, Vesper nodded. Is it true you flew 12 missions in contested airspace without being detected? Vesper considered the question. Yes, but what they don't tell you about those missions is that I was scared out of my mind every single time. Fear doesn't make you weak. It makes you careful, and careful keeps you alive. Another pilot, a man with a southern accent and a scar on his jaw, spoke up. They say you died. How do you come back from that? Vesper smiled grimly. You don't, you become someone else, but we're not here to talk about ghosts. We're here to make sure you don't become one. She moved to the front of the room, pulling up a tactical map on the screen. This is where we start, not with flying, with thinking, with understanding that every decision you make up there has consequences down here. She pointed to a location on the map. This is where I lost my wingman. Call sign, Raptor 6. He was 24, engaged to be married. Died because I made a split-second decision that turned out to be wrong. The room went silent. Vesper continued, her voice steady. His name was Marcus Delacroix. He trusted me, and I failed him. I carry that every day. And the reason I'm telling you this isn't to scare you. It's to make you understand that this job isn't about glory. It's about bringing everyone home, including yourself. She let that sink in. Then she smiled. Now, let's talk about how you're going to be better than I was. For the next 8 hours, Vesper taught. She showed them simulations of missions that had gone sideways. She taught them evasion patterns that weren't in any manual. She explained the psychology of aerial combat, the way fear and adrenaline could make you stupid if you didn't control them. And slowly, the pilots began to understand that they weren't being trained by a legend. They were being trained by someone who'd bled for every piece of knowledge she was giving them. By evening, they were exhausted. But when Vesper dismissed them, none of them wanted to leave. The young woman with sharp eyes lingered. Ma'am, can I ask you something personal? Vesper nodded. What made you come back, after being dead for so long? Vesper thought about Lieutenant Cade, about the voice on the radio, about the choice to pick up that headset. Because somewhere up there a pilot is going to have a bad day, and if I can teach you how to help them through it, then maybe Marcus didn't die for nothing. The pilot nodded slowly. What's your call sign for us? Vesper hadn't used her call sign in over a decade, but standing there in that briefing room training the next generation, it felt right to reclaim it. Ghost, she said quietly. You can call me Ghost. The young pilot smiled. Copy that, Ghost. See you tomorrow. She left. Vesper stood alone in the briefing room, surrounded by maps and simulations and the weight of memory. Colonel Reeves appeared in the doorway. How'd it go? Vesper looked at her. They're good, raw but good. They'll make it if they listen. Reeves nodded. And you, how are you? It was a question Vesper hadn't expected. She considered it carefully. I'm not sure yet. Ask me in 6 months. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Vesper taught at Blackthorn 3 days a week, pushing her pilots through scenarios that would have broken most people. She was demanding, uncompromising, and occasionally harsh. But she was also fair. And slowly, the pilots began to understand that every critique was meant to save their lives. On the other days, she taught physics. She explained momentum and velocity to teenagers who had no idea their teacher spent her other time preparing pilots for war. Duality was strange, but Vesper found she needed both. The students reminded her of normalcy. The pilots reminded her of purpose. One evening, after a particularly brutal simulation session, the young woman with sharp eyes, Lieutenant Kendra Oakes, approached her. Ghost, can I ask you about Kandahar? Vesper tensed. What about it? Kendra hesitated. They say you flew into a situation everyone else said was impossible, that you extracted a team under fire with no support. Is that true? Vesper looked at her for a long moment. Yes, but what they don't tell you is that I had to leave 2 people behind. They didn't make it. So every time someone calls it impossible, I think about those 2 faces, and I wonder if I could have done something different. Kendra absorbed this. But you saved the others, that counts for something. Vesper's expression was unreadable. Does it? Ask the families of the ones I left behind if it counts. She paused. This job isn't about counting victories, Lieutenant. It's about living with the decisions you make when there are no good options. Kendra nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me the truth. Vesper softened slightly. You remind me of myself at your age. Confident. Maybe too confident. Remember that confidence gets you in the door. Humility keeps you alive. Kendra smiled. I'll try to remember that, ma'am. As she walked away, Vesper felt something shift. These pilots were becoming more than students. They were becoming her responsibility. And with that responsibility came the fear that she might lose them the way she'd lost Marcus. That night, Vesper sat in her flat with Newton on her lap, thinking about legacy, about what it meant to pass on knowledge earned in blood, about whether redemption was possible for ghosts. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Ghost, this is Viper9, just wanted to say thank you. I'm home because of you. I won't forget that. Vesper stared at the message for a long time, then she typed a reply. Stay safe up there, Viper. The sky doesn't forgive mistakes, but it always offers another sunrise. She hit send and set the phone down. Newton purred, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. Vesper scratched behind his ears and allowed herself a small smile. Maybe ghosts could find redemption, 1 pilot at a time. The next morning she returned to Blackthorn. Her 6 pilots were waiting in the briefing room, ready for whatever impossible scenario she'd prepared. Vesper looked at them and saw the future, saw the pilots who would fly missions she couldn't imagine, who would face threats she'd never encountered, who would come home because she taught them how. All right, she said, pulling up the day's simulation. Today we're going to talk about what happens when everything goes wrong, when your instruments fail, when your wingman is hit, when the mission parameters change mid-flight, because that's not if, that's when. She ran them through scenarios that had no easy answers, forced them to make impossible choices, watched as they struggled and failed and got back up to try again. And in those moments Vesper saw herself, saw the pilot she'd been before Kandahar, before the crash that wasn't a crash, before she became a ghost. At the end of the session, Lieutenant Oakes approached her again. Ghost, that last scenario, there was no good answer, was there? Vesper shook her head. No, Sometimes there isn't. But what matters is that you made a decision and owned it. In combat, hesitation kills more pilots than enemy fire. Oakes considered this. How do you live with the bad decisions? Vesper's expression turned distant. You don't, you carry them, and you hope that the good decisions outnumber them enough to matter. It was an honest answer, maybe too honest, but these pilots deserve the truth. They deserve to know that the job would cost them pieces of themselves. That coming home wasn't always the same as surviving. Weeks turned into months. Vesper's pilots improved at a rate that impressed even Colonel Reeves. They learned to think like their instructor, 3 moves ahead, always calculating risk, never assuming anything was safe. They learned her evasion patterns, her tactical philosophy, her understanding of aerial combat as a chess game played at Mach speed. But more than that, they learned to take care of each other. Vesper drilled into them that no mission was worth losing your wingman, that bringing everyone home was the only acceptable outcome. She told them stories about Marcus, about the other pilots she'd lost, about the weight of command and the cost of survival. One afternoon, during a routine training flight in the simulators, Lieutenant Oakes faced a scenario that mirrored Kandahar. Pinned down, enemy closing in, no clear exit. Vesper watched from the control room as Oakes worked through the problem. Tried 3 different approaches, failed each time. Finally, with enemy fire simulated all around her, Oakes made a decision that was reckless and brilliant in equal measure. She flew straight at the threat, drawing fire, giving her simulated team time to extract. The simulation ended. Oakes had survived, but barely. She emerged from the simulator shaking. Vesper met her at the door. That was stupid, Vesper said flatly. Oakes bristled. It worked. Vesper stepped closer. This time in a simulation, but in real life with real bullets and real consequences. That move gets you killed. And then your team has no one to lead them home. She paused. You're thinking like a hero. I need you to think like a survivor. Oakes' jaw tightened. You did the same thing at Kandahar. Vesper's expression went cold. Yes, I did, and I've regretted it every day since, because heroes die, Lieutenant, and dead heroes don't teach the next generation how to do better. The room was silent. Then Vesper's expression softened. You have the instincts, you have the skill, but you need to temper that confidence with wisdom. Learn from my mistakes, don't repeat them. Oakes nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am. As she walked away, Vesper felt the weight of teaching, of trying to pass on lessons that couldn't truly be understood until you'd lived them. That evening, Vesper received a call from Colonel Reeves. We have a situation, I need you to consult. Vesper felt her stomach tight. I don't do operational work, that was the deal. Reeves's voice was steady. This isn't operational, it's tactical planning. We have a mission in the works and the team requested your input, specifically Lieutenant Cade. Vesper closed her eyes. Viper 9. The pilot she'd saved months ago. What's the mission? Reeves gave her the basics. Extraction in hostile territory, tight time frame, high risk, the kind of mission that got people killed if every detail wasn't perfect. They want your assessment of the approach vectors, your read on the risks. Vesper wanted to say no. She wanted to stay in her lane, teaching and nothing else, but she thought about Cade's voice on the radio, about the debt she'd never asked for but felt anyway. Send me the briefing materials, I'll review them. She spent the next 2 days analyzing every aspect of the mission, found 3 critical flaws in the plan, rewrote approach vectors, identified escape routes no one else had considered. When she presented her findings to the mission planning team, they listened with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd earned it in blood. Lieutenant Cade was there, older looking than his voice suggested, with eyes that had seen combat. He thanked her when the briefing ended. Ma'am, I wouldn't be here if not for you. Neither would my crew. Vesper nodded. Then don't waste it, fly smart, come home. The mission launched 3 days later. Vesper watched the clock, unable to focus on anything else. She knew the timeline, knew the risks, knew that even with perfect planning, things could go wrong. Hours passed like years. Finally, her phone buzzed, a message from Reeves. Mission successful, 0 casualties. Cade says to tell you that your vectors were perfect. Vesper exhaled a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Then she returned to her normal life, teaching physics and training pilots and being the ghost who refused to stay dead. But the mission had reminded her of something important. She couldn't fly anymore, but she could still save lives, still make a difference, still honor the memory of the pilots who hadn't made it home. Her students at Blackthorn graduated from the program 6 months after she started teaching. All six passed. All six went operational. And all six carried with them the lessons of a pilot who'd learned them the hardest way possible. At the graduation ceremony, Lieutenant Oakes gave a speech. "We came here thinking we'd be trained by a legend. We were wrong. We were trained by a human being who made mistakes and owned them, who taught us that survival isn't about being fearless. It's about being smart, being careful, being willing to learn." She looked directly at Vesper. "Ghost taught us how to live, and that's worth more than any medal.